The Windowpane test. It's supposed to be a simple way to know when your dough is perfectly kneaded. You just try to stretch a small piece until it forms a transparent membrane. If it tears, you need more. If it holds, you're golden. But for such a simple test, it causes a huge debate. Some bakers swear by it, calling it the most important baking test for your dough. Others call it unnecessary, useless, or even a myth. They say their bread turns out great even if their dough fails this test. So what's the truth? Is the Windowpane test a brilliant idea or a useless myth? And if it is useful, why do so many home bakers struggle with it? Let's get into it. Hey, Seraphin here. Welcome back to the channel. The Windowpane test involves stretching a piece of dough into a thin, translucent film, one so thin you can see light through it, like a window pane. If the dough rips before you can properly stretch it, you should keep kneading the dough, and if it stretches like this, then your dough is properly kneaded. Although this test is definitely not new, it's hard to tell when the Windowpane test became popular with home bakers. In fact, many older recipes and sources make no mention of this dough testing method. In this French baking book from the 1700s, a well-kneaded dough is one that no longer sticks to the hands. No sign of a Windowpane test. It's not until you start digging into books from the 20th century that you find methods similar to the Windowpane test. One of the earliest mentions I found comes from a book published in 1987. It states that a well-kneaded dough should be able to stretch into a paper-thin sheet. It's not called the Windowpane test, but it sounds incredibly similar. Of course, in the time since, the Windowpane test has become more and more popular, being added to countless recipes, books, and more. However, if you pay attention to many of these resources, you might notice something off. Despite its popularity, explanations for the Windowpane test are often quickly rushed through, and in older books from the 80s or 90s, the explanation is often entirely absent. Some resources will talk about gluten development and how a fully kneaded dough is more elastic and stretchy, but they never seem to talk about why a Windowpane test is a good measure of that. What makes stretching the dough into a thin sheet a superior test compared to poking it or pulling it in one direction? The Windowpane test seems to have come out of nowhere. And even worse, there's typically very little mention of what to do when your dough just won't pass the test. As a result of this, if you look online, you'll find countless posts from frustrated bakers whose doughs never seem to pass the test, no matter how long they knead or mix the dough for. And there are even some bakers who have completely lost confidence in this test. You'll see posts from people who swear they've never done it and their bread turns out fantastic. I've even seen a few home bakers call it a myth. This is bolstered by the fact that numerous bakers have found that failing a Windowpane test doesn't necessarily mean a failed loaf of bread, which is, again, something that many resources completely avoid talking about. Without any explanations, I think a lot of home bakers have found the Windowpane test a confusing subject at best and a useless one at worst. The problem with the Windowpane test has evolved beyond troubleshooting into a matter of trust, which is truly unfortunate because the test itself is valid and well-founded. The principles behind the Windowpane test are based on science, and it can actually be very useful if you do it properly. Done right, the Windowpane test can be a measure of something far more fundamental to the bread. To see how this works, we need to look at a machine. In the 1920s, a French engineer, Marcel Chopin, invented this machine that eventually became known as the Alveograph. And what it basically does is a standardized version of the Windowpane test. This machine mechanically stretches a piece of dough by inflating it with air, expanding a small dough balloon until it rips and deflates. But what was it invented for? Well, it was actually made to test flours. You see, in many parts of the world, North America included, we've come to label wheat flour with bread flour or AP flour to indicate its protein content and intended usage. And in Europe, many countries use the T number label along with W indexes. But behind these printed words, there's a team of people whose job is to make sure the flour quality is up to standard. Wheat comes in a lot of varieties, and many aren't particularly suitable for making bread, especially if you want something that's soft and fluffy. Take France, for example, as explained by the late Professor Raymond Calvel. This was actually a problem for French bakers because wheat and flour quality in France were generally poor until around 1935 to 1940. So it would be important to test the flour for its baking quality. One way to do this is to just make bread. You make a dough with the flour and then bake it. But Chopin wanted to find a way to test the dough rather than do baking tests. His solution was this machine that we've come to know as the Alveograph. As I mentioned, it mechanically stretches a piece of dough by inflating it with air, expanding until a small dough balloon rips and deflates. This paper states that the machine was meant to standardize the dough veil test, which is essentially the French version of the windowpane test. But why is the Alveograph a good way to test doughs? And how does that relate to the windowpane test? Well, Chopin believed that stretching the dough like this should be closer to how the dough actually rises. During fermentation and oven spring, yeast produces carbon dioxide, which diffuses into small air pockets incorporated during mixing, inflating them and forcing the dough to expand. This expansion is contained by the viscoelastic gluten network. As these bubbles grow, they stretch the dough biaxially, that is, in two perpendicular directions at once, much like the skin of a balloon. This is fundamentally different from pulling an elastic band, which only stretches in one direction. Instead, the dough is forced to stretch into a thin, two-dimensional membrane. This brings us directly to the windowpane test. In essence, it's a home baker's Alveograph. Think about it. You're not pulling the dough in a single coaxial direction. You are stretching it outwards in two perpendicular directions to create that thin film. This is a direct physical test of that same biaxial extension. While it doesn't have a lab-certified paper, the test is far from baseless. It's a tangible way to assess how your dough will actually perform when it needs to hold gas and expand. Because the windowpane test forces us to create a super thin membrane, it is a direct test of extensibility, a property that is fundamentally linked to your final bread quality. If a dough has high extensibility, then it can stretch for longer without breaking, holding on to more gas inside. The ability of the dough to hold on to gas bubbles can determine bread quality, especially volume. It can also be the difference between a nice, even crumb and one with large, irregular holes. This is because extensibility is related to an important process in bread making called strain hardening. Strain hardening is defined as the phenomenon where the stress required to deform material increases more than proportionally to the strain. When you knead the dough, you are stretching and realigning the gluten proteins to build a stronger network. This developed network is what gives the dough its strain hardening ability. Ideally, at the end of the kneading process, the dough should be a lot stronger. This means when you try to stretch it, it will resist that force and grow stiffer as it stretches. It will exhibit strain hardening. This may sound like it's in contrast to the windowpane test. After all, if the dough is harder to stretch, then wouldn't it tear more easily? Well, not quite. Think about it this way. Extensibility is about stretching a dough to its limit. Strain hardening is what strengthens the dough as it stretches. It gives crucial support to the thinner and weaker parts of that membrane, preventing the film from rupturing prematurely. This is why strain hardening is considered a requirement for gas retention in dough. It is essential for stabilizing the dough films between gas cells against rupture and premature coalescence during proofing and oven rise. Of course, no dough can hold on to gas forever. It will eventually escape. The entire goal is to make sure it stays trapped through the most crucial moments, the final proof and the initial oven spring. If the gas leaks out too early, the result is often a loaf with large irregular holes, leading to a denser crumb and smaller volume. In short, if you enjoy a fluffy, well-risen loaf, this strain hardening property isn't just a technical detail, it's absolutely critical. Strain hardening must also be maintained at elevated temperatures for good bread making performance. Good bread-making varieties show cell walls that remain stable and retain their strain hardening properties up to higher temperatures, up to 60 degrees Celsius. Conversely, poor bread-making doughs exhibit strain hardening that decreases at lower temperatures, leading to earlier bubble coalescence and reduced loaf volume, which illustrates the importance of using a good bread flour. Okay. With all this science, we can see that the Windowpane test isn't useless or baseless at all. In fact, it's a pretty practical test for these very important properties. But this brings us back to one of our original questions. Why do so many people fail the Windowpane test and still end up with good bread? Well, the answer lies in the details. There's a fundamental difference in how the Windowpane test is done and Alveograph tests are done. The Alveograph tests dough in a controlled environment with a set hydration and a standardized mixer. The machine itself also measures a lot more than just how well the dough stretches, including the strain hardening index as a more advanced parameter that can be derived from the Alveograph curve. This is very different from how the Windowpane test is done, and it's probably the biggest reason why so many doughs fail the test despite using high-quality bread flour. To put it bluntly, the bread flour we're using has probably already passed a version of this test at the mill, but our specific recipes change the dough's behavior. Our dough isn't a standardized lab sample. We use different hydration levels and ingredients. That's why most of our doughs won't pass the test perfectly right out of the mixer. Of course, one of the most common reasons a dough fails the Windowpane test is that it's simply undermixed. The gluten network hasn't yet had enough time and mechanical action to form a strong cohesive structure. However, this initial failure often doesn't matter because gluten development continues long after mixing. If your dough improves over time, you're seeing the positive effects of fermentation and handling. Letting the dough rest during bulk fermentation, for example, builds strength as the gluten network rearranges itself. Additionally, physical steps like shaping strengthen the dough significantly. Consider making cinnamon rolls or shokubang. The act of rolling the dough flat and then folding it is a powerful step that further aligns the gluten. That's why a dough that fails the test right after mixing could easily pass it after a few sets of folds or a strong shaping process. It's also important to note that extensibility actually goes down when the dough is kneaded for too long, especially if it's done with a mixer. So if your dough is not passing the Windowpane test and you've been mixing your dough for much longer than expected, it might be a good idea to simply stop mixing and let the dough rest first. So with the Windowpane test, resting the dough is crucial, both because it helps the dough relax and it also helps to strengthen the dough, allowing it to recover from the many broken bonds during mixing. Now, extensibility is also affected by multiple variables beside the gluten network quality, including the water absorption capacity of the flour and the water content in the dough. What this means is that depending on the hydration of the flour, you might have to exert more or less strength to get an ideal Windowpane test. Just remember to compare apples to apples. For example, an 80% hydration dough might pass the test, but the resulting film will feel much more delicate and less durable than one from a 60% hydration dough. Both can be ready, but they will feel different. One very helpful tip that may aid you is that you may also want to add a bit of oil to the outside of the dough piece that's being tested, as well as your hands. This way you prevent the dough from sticking onto your fingers, which can interfere with the whole process. Now, what we've talked about has been focused on doughs that were kneaded or mixed to almost full development. For the so-called no-knead doughs where stretch and folds and other similar methods are used, we need a slightly different approach. The dough will absolutely fail the test after the initial mix. Development happens over a long fermentation aided by periodic folds. The folds help align the gluten strands and the long rest periods build strength. You should be able to get a positive Windowpane test after the final round of folds at the end of bulk fermentation or before shaping. It's also important to note that how you perform the test is crucial. Don't yank or pull the dough aggressively. Be gentle. Use your fingertips to slowly and carefully stretch the dough outwards from the center. Some doughs are naturally easier to stretch, those with higher hydrations or added fats, for example. But with a bit of patience and a gentle touch, most bread doughs should reveal that beautiful, translucent window pane when they're ready. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and bye!